15-year-old girl returns man's lost wallet. What happens next is shocking. The autumn wind whipped through Lena Carter's dark hair as she trudged home from school, her mind wandering to the math test she'd probably failed. The sidewalk was littered with crisp orange leaves that crunched beneath her feet, providing a rhythmic soundtrack to her gloomy thoughts. At 15, she had enough on her plate without worrying about dropping grades, but here she was, dreading the moment she'd have to tell her mom. The sound of a car horn jolted her from her thoughts. As she glanced up, something caught her eye, a worn leather wallet lying face down on the sidewalk, partially hidden under a pile of leaves. Lena stopped, adjusting her backpack as she stared at it. Someone was probably freaking out right now, searching their pockets in panic. "Hello?" she called out, looking around the quiet suburban street. No response. No one running back frantically searching for their lost possession. Just the whisper of wind through nearly bare trees and the distant sound of traffic. Sighing, she picked up the wallet. It was heavy, well-used, the leather soft and creased from years of being sat on. The responsible thing would be to look for ID and try to return it. Her mom had always taught her that doing the right thing mattered, even when no one was watching. Lena opened the wallet, and her heart skipped a beat. The driver's license inside was old, the edges worn, but the name jumped out at her like it was written in neon: Daniel Carter. Carter. Her last name. Her hands trembled slightly as she stared at the photo. The man looked to be in his mid-30s, with dark hair like hers and a serious expression. She'd seen plenty of Carters in her life. It wasn't exactly an uncommon name, but something about this felt different. Maybe it was the way his eyes seemed to pierce through the photo, or how the shape of his jaw reminded her of her own reflection. "Don't be stupid," she muttered to herself, shaking her head. "It's just a coincidence." But she couldn't shake the feeling as she checked the address on the license. Maple Grove Apartments, just a few blocks away. She knew the place, an old complex that had seen better days, with peeling paint and rusted railings. Her mom always said to avoid that area, especially after dark. The smart thing would be to drop it off at the police station. Let them handle it. But curiosity gnawed at her, and persistent itch she couldn't ignore. Besides, the police station was in the opposite direction, and it was getting late. Before she could talk herself out of it, Lena's feet were already carrying her toward Maple Grove Apartments. The closer she got, the more her heart raced. The building loomed ahead, a faded 3-story structure that seemed to lean slightly to one side. Paint peeled from the walls like old scabs, and several windows were covered with newspaper instead of curtains. Apartment 2B. She climbed the metal stairs, each step creaking under her weight. The corridor smelled of old cigarettes, and something else she couldn't quite identify. Maybe loneliness, if loneliness had a smell. A flickering fluorescent light buzzed overhead, creating dancing shadows on the grimy walls. Standing before the door, Lena suddenly felt foolish. What was she doing here? This wasn't some fairy tale where lost wallets led to magical discoveries. This was real life, where coincidences were just coincidences, and strange men in rundown apartments were usually best avoided. But she'd come this far. Taking a deep breath, she knocked. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for ages. Just as she was about to turn away, convinced no one was home, she heard movement inside. Slow, heavy footsteps approached the door. The lock clicked, and the door creaked open just enough to reveal a face that made Lena's breath catch in her throat. The man was older than in his license photo, with gray streaking his dark hair and deep lines etched around his eyes, but it was unmistakably him. Those eyes, they were like looking into a mirror, the same unusual gray-green she saw every morning. He looked tired, wearing a faded t-shirt with a small hole near the collar. His expression shifted from irritation to confusion as he took in the sight of her. Then, as his eyes widened in what looked like recognition or shock, Lena felt a chill run down her spine. "I found your wallet," she managed to say, her voice sounding smaller than she intended. She held it out like a peace offering. The man, Daniel Carter, didn't move to take it. He just stared at her, his face draining of color, as if he'd seen a ghost. His hands gripped the doorframe so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Are you okay?" Lena asked, fighting the urge to step back. He seemed to shake himself out of whatever trance he was in. "Yes, sorry, I just..." His voice was rough, like he didn't use it much. He reached for the wallet with a trembling hand, and as he did, Lena noticed a strange scar running along his forearm, 3 parallel lines, like claw marks. "Thank you," he said quietly, still staring at her in that unsettling way. There was something in his eyes, pain, fear, recognition? She couldn't tell. "Do we?" Lena started, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. "Do we know each other?" The question seemed to hit him like a physical blow. He took a sharp breath, his grip tightening on the wallet. For a moment, it looked like he might say something important, something that would explain the strange tension crackling in the air between them. Instead, he shook his head. "No," he said roughly. "We don't." And before Lena could say another word, he stepped back and closed the door with a decisive click. Lena stood there, staring at the worn wood of the door, her mind spinning. She'd expected a simple thank you, maybe a small reward. Instead, she felt like she'd stepped into a mystery she wasn't supposed to uncover. That look in his eyes, it wasn't the look you gave a stranger. It was the look of someone who'd seen a ghost from their past materialize on their doorstep. As she turned to leave, her phone buzzed in her pocket. A text from her mom. "Where are you? Dinner's getting cold." Lena took one last look at the door before heading down the creaking stairs. She had a feeling her math test wouldn't be the most important thing she'd have to tell her mom about tonight. The walk home felt like moving through a dream. Lena's mind kept replaying that moment, the way Daniel Carter's eyes had widened in recognition, the tremor in his hands, the scar on his arm. Something wasn't adding up, and she had a feeling her mother might be the one holding the missing pieces. The porch light was on when she reached home, casting a warm glow that usually felt welcoming but tonight seemed to illuminate her uncertainty. Through the window, she could see her mother moving around the kitchen, probably reheating dinner for the 3rd time. Sarah Carter was still wearing her nurse's scrubs, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, the same way she always looked after a long shift at the hospital. Lena's hand hesitated on the doorknob. Once she stepped inside, once she asked the questions burning in her mind, something would change. She could feel it in her bones. The door creaked as she entered, announcing her presence. "Mom? I'm home. Finally!" Her mother's voice carried from the kitchen. "I was starting to worry. Your chicken's probably dry as cardboard by now, but..." She appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel, but stopped mid-sentence when she saw Lena's face. "What's wrong?" Lena dropped her backpack by the door, trying to find the right words. "Something weird happened today." "Weird how?" Her mother's expression shifted subtly, a tightening around the eyes, a slight tension in her shoulders. It was the same look she got when Lena asked about her father, which had happened less and less over the years as she learned to stop hoping for answers. "I found a wallet," Lena began, watching her mother carefully. "On Maple Street." "And?" Her mother's voice was carefully neutral, but her knuckles were white where she gripped the dish towel. "It belonged to someone named Daniel Carter." The dish towel slipped from her mother's hands, falling to the floor in a heap. The color drained from her face so quickly that Lena stepped forward, worried she might faint. "Mom? You didn't." Her mother's voice was barely a whisper. "Tell me you didn't try to return it." "I did." Lena moved closer, noting how her mother's hands had started to shake. "Mom, what's going on?" "The way he looked at me, it wasn't normal. It was like he knew me." Sarah Carter sank into one of the kitchen chairs, her legs seeming to give out beneath her. For a long moment, she just sat there, staring at nothing, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "He does know you. Or he did. Once." "What do you mean?" But even as Lena asked, a possibility she'd never seriously considered began to take shape in her mind. "Daniel Carter," her mother said, the name seeming to catch in her throat, "is your father." The words hit Lena like a physical blow. She gripped the back of a chair to steady herself, her mind spinning. But you said he abandoned us. Before I was born. Her mother's laugh was hollow, bitter. Is that what I said? Or is that what you assumed, and I just never corrected you? Mom! Anger flared in Lena's chest, hot and sudden. How could you let me believe that? All these years I thought. Sit down, Lena. Her mother's voice was tired, heavy with the weight of secrets too long carried. Please. There's something you need to understand. Lena sat, her movements stiff with anger and confusion. The kitchen clock ticked loudly in the silence, marking each second of truth finally coming to light. Your father didn't abandon us, Sarah began, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the table's surface. He was forced to leave. To protect us. Protect us? From what? Her mother's eyes met hers, and Lena was startled to see fear there, real, tangible fear. From very dangerous people. People who would have hurt us to get to him. What are you talking about? What dangerous people? Sarah took a shaky breath. Your father. He worked as an accountant at Morton Financial. It was a good job, normal. Until he noticed something wrong with the numbers. Money moving where it shouldn't be, huge sums disappearing and reappearing in ways that didn't make sense. Lena leaned forward, her anger temporarily forgotten. What kind of money? The kind that belongs to people you don't want to cross. He thought he was doing the right thing by reporting it to his superiors. Instead, he discovered that they were part of it, part of something much bigger and darker than he'd imagined. A chill ran down Lena's spine as she remembered the scar on Daniel's arm. What happened? They threatened him. Told him to keep quiet, to look the other way. But your father... A sad smile crossed her mother's face. He was always too honest for his own good. He went to the FBI instead. And 2 days later, our car's brakes failed. I was 8 months pregnant with you at the time. The doctors said it was a miracle we survived. Her mother's hand unconsciously moved to her right leg, where Lena knew a long scar ran from knee to hip, a souvenir, she'd always said, from a bad accident. That wasn't an accident, Lena whispered, the reality of it sinking in. No. Her mother's voice was flat. It was a warning. And your father, he understood the message. He disappeared that night. Left everything behind, his job, his home, his whole life. Left us. She wiped at her eyes. To keep us safe. Lena sat back, her mind struggling to process this new reality. All these years, she'd carried around an image of a father who didn't care enough to stay. Now that image was shattering, replacing itself with something far more complex and painful. Why didn't you tell me? Because knowing the truth would have put you in danger. Her mother reached across the table, taking Lena's hand. As long as you believed he'd abandoned us, as long as you showed no interest in finding him, you were safe. We both were. But he's here now, Lena said. In that rundown apartment. Why? What happened to those people he was running from? Her mother's grip on her hand tightened. I don't know. And that's what scares me. She looked at Lena with desperate intensity. Promise me you won't go back there. Promise me you'll stay away from him. But even as she nodded, Lena knew it was a promise she couldn't keep. She had spent 15 years wondering about her father, creating stories in her head about who he was and why he left. Now that she knew the truth, or at least part of it, there was no way she could just walk away. I need to do my homework, she said, standing up. Her mother's face showed clear relief at what she interpreted as Lena's acceptance of the situation. But as Lena climbed the stairs to her room, her mind was already working. She had questions, so many questions, and only one person could answer them. Tomorrow, she decided she would go back to Maple Grove Apartments. This time, Daniel Carter wouldn't be able to just close the door. Sleep hadn't come easily to Lena that night. She tossed and turned, her mind spinning with questions, piecing together memories that suddenly looked different in light of what she knew. The times she'd caught her mother staring at old photos when she thought Lena wasn't looking. The way they'd moved 3 times before settling in their current home, always with vague explanations about better opportunities. The persistent feeling that her mother was watching, always watching, for something or someone. Morning came with a decision. Lena waited until her mother left for her hospital shift, then pulled out the yearbook she'd stolen from the school library yesterday afternoon. She'd stayed up late searching through its pages until she found what she was looking for, a younger version of Daniel Carter in the Morton Financial Company photo, standing in the back row with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. The photo was dated 15 years ago, just months before he disappeared. Lena studied his face, looking for traces of herself in his features. The same high cheekbones, the same gray-green eyes. How had she never seen a photo of him before? Her mother must have hidden them all away, along with every other trace of his existence. The bus ride to Maple Grove Apartments felt longer this time, each stop an exercise in controlling her nerves. She told herself this was about getting answers, but sitting there, watching the familiar streets roll by, she had to admit it was more than that. This was about finding the missing piece of herself she'd never known was lost. The apartment building looked even more decrepit in the harsh morning light. A cat watched her suspiciously from a rusty railing as she climbed the stairs, her heart pounding with each step. This time, when she reached apartment 2B, she didn't hesitate before knocking. No answer. She knocked again, louder this time. "I know you're in there," she called out, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. "And I know who you are." The silence stretched for what felt like minutes. Then, finally, the sound of footsteps. The door opened, revealing Daniel Carter looking even more worn than yesterday, if that was possible. His eyes were red-rimmed, like he hadn't slept either. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly, but he didn't close the door. "Why?" "Because of the people who tried to finish Mom. The ones who made you run away?" His face paled. "She told you. Some of it." Lena crossed her arms, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I want to hear the rest from you." He looked past her, scanning the empty hallway with practiced wariness. Then, reluctantly, he stepped aside. "Come in. Quickly." The apartment was small and sparsely furnished, but surprisingly clean. A laptop sat open on a folding table, surrounded by stacks of papers. The walls were bare except for one thing, a small photo frame turned face down on a shelf. "Sit," he said, gesturing to one of two chairs at the table. As Lena sat, he moved to the window, peering out through a gap in the curtains before turning back to her. "You look so much like her," he said softly, almost to himself. "Mom said you left to protect us," Lena said, cutting straight to the point. "But you're here now. Why? What happened to the people you were running from?" Daniel ran a hand through his gray-streaked hair, a gesture so familiar it made Lena's chest ache. She did the same thing when she was stressed. "It's complicated." "Then uncomplicated," she demanded. "I've spent 15 years thinking you didn't want me. That you walked away because being a father was too hard. I deserve the truth." He flinched at her words, pain flashing across his face. "You're right," he said after a long moment. "You do deserve the truth." He sat down heavily in the other chair. "The people I discovered at Morton Financial, they weren't just corrupt businessmen. They were working for a criminal organization, laundering money on a massive scale. Drug money, mostly, but other things too. Horrible things. And you reported them to the FBI. I tried." His laugh was bitter. "But they had people everywhere. In the FBI, in the police, in the DA's office. The agent I trusted, the one I gave all my evidence to, he disappeared 3 days later. They found his car in the river." He absently rubbed the scar on his arm. "That's when I knew how deep it went." "The car accident," Lena said. "With Mom. Wasn't an accident." His voice hardened. "They wanted me to understand what would happen if I didn't disappear. If I didn't take what I knew and vanish." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a pain so raw it made her throat tight. "Your mother was 8 months pregnant. When I heard about the crash, when I saw her in the hospital." He stopped, swallowing hard. "But you still left. Because they made it clear that next time, They wouldn't just send a warning. He leaned forward, his voice intense. I couldn't let that happen. So I ran. Changed my name, moved constantly, took whatever work I could find that wouldn't draw attention. But I never stopped watching over you both. Lena's mind flashed to strange moments from her childhood. A feeling of being watched on the playground, a glimpse of a familiar figure that disappeared when she looked again. You were there? He nodded. From a distance. Every school play, every soccer game. Your 10th birthday party at the park. The time you broke your arm falling off your bike. His voice cracked. I wanted so badly to be there, to help you up, to tell you how brave you were. But I couldn't. What changed? Lena asked. Why are you here now? Daniel stood up abruptly, moving to the shelf with the face-down photo. He picked it up, staring at it for a moment before handing it to her. It was a newspaper clipping, dated 6 months ago. The headline read, Morton financial executives found guilty in massive money laundering scheme. They finally got caught, he said quietly. Not because of me, because they got greedy, made mistakes. The organization fell apart. Most of the key players are in prison now, or finished. He took back the clipping, his hands trembling slightly. I thought maybe it was finally safe to come back. To try to explain. But when I got here, when I saw how well you and your mother were doing without me. He shook his head. I couldn't bring myself to disrupt your lives. So I just watched. Like always. Until I showed up with your wallet. Lena said, understanding dawning. Until you showed up with my wallet. He smiled faintly. Maybe the universe has a sense of humor after all. Lena sat in silence, processing everything. The truth was simultaneously better and worse than anything she'd imagined. Her father hadn't abandoned them. He'd sacrificed everything to keep them safe. But that sacrifice had cost all of them 15 years they could never get back. Mom needs to know you're here, she said finally. Fear flashed across his face. Lena, I don't think. She deserves to know, Lena interrupted. And you deserve a chance to explain. To try to make things right. She stood up, her decision made. I'm going to tell her. Tonight. You can either be there or... She let the alternative hang in the air between them. Daniel Carter looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and saw the strength he'd always hoped she would have. The strength that came from her mother. Okay, he said softly. Okay. The walk home felt like marching toward a storm. Lena could feel Daniel's nervous energy radiating off him as they approached the house. He changed into a clean shirt and combed his hair, but nothing could hide the years etched into his face or the way his hands kept fidgeting with his jacket sleeve. Maybe this isn't a good idea, he said for the third time, slowing his pace. The setting sun cast long shadows across the suburban street, turning everything golden and strange. Mom's shift ends at 6. Lena replied, checking her phone. She'll be home any minute. She looked up at him, seeing the fear in his eyes. You're not running away again. Not this time. They reached the house just as Sarah's car pulled into the driveway. Lena watched her mother through the windshield, saw the exact moment she registered Daniel's presence. Sarah's hands gripped the steering wheel so tight her knuckles turned white, and for a moment she didn't move at all. Then, slowly, she got out of the car. She was still in her scrubs, her hair messy from a long day at the hospital. But something in her posture had changed. She stood straighter, almost defensive, like she was preparing for a fight. Sarah, Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. Don't. Her mother's voice was sharp as broken glass. Lena, go inside. Mom! No. But Lena stood her ground. No. We need to talk. All of us. The tension crackled in the air between them, thick enough to cut. A neighbor walked by with their dog, slowing to stare at the scene unfolding in the driveway. Sarah noticed, and her jaw tightened. Inside, she said again, but this time she included Daniel in her gaze. Both of you. The kitchen had never felt smaller than it did with the three of them standing there. Sarah moved mechanically, putting her purse down, taking off her jacket, each movement deliberate and controlled. 15 years, she finally said, her back still turned to them. 15 years of silence, of wondering if you were dead or alive. And now you just show up on our doorstep? I never stopped watching over you, Daniel said. Both of you. I was always. Don't you dare! Sarah whirled around, her eyes blazing. Don't you dare tell me you were always there. Where were you when Lena had pneumonia at age 7? Where were you when I was working double shifts just to keep us afloat? Where were you when she cried herself to sleep asking why her daddy didn't love her enough to stay? Each question hit Daniel like a physical blow. He seemed to shrink under Sarah's fury, and Lena saw tears in his eyes. I wanted to come back, he said, his voice rough. Every single day, I wanted to come back. But they were still out there, still watching. If they had found out I was in contact with you. The men from Morton Financial, Sarah said. I know. Lena told me you said they're gone now. Most of them are in prison. The organization fell apart 6 months ago. He pulled out the newspaper clipping from his pocket, the one he'd shown Lena. I've been watching the trials, following every detail. Making sure it was really over. Sarah took the clipping with trembling hands, her eyes scanning the headline. 6 months ago, she repeated. And you're only showing up now because Lena found your wallet? I was afraid, Daniel admitted, and something in his honesty seemed to catch Sarah off guard. I've spent 15 years being afraid. Afraid they'd find me, afraid they'd hurt you, afraid you'd hate me for leaving. When the trials ended, when I knew it was finally safe, I came back to town. I rented that apartment, thinking maybe I could find a way to approach you, to explain. But then I saw how well you were doing without me. You saw what you wanted to see, Sarah said, but some of the anger had drained from her voice. We survived, yes. We built a life. But there was always something missing. She looked at Lena, her expression softening. Someone missing. I have proof, Daniel said suddenly, reaching for his laptop bag. Of everything. The original financial records I found, the threats, the surveillance photos they took of you before the car accident. I kept it all encrypted, hidden. I thought maybe someday it would be safe to show you. To help you understand why I had to leave. He pulled out the laptop, but Sarah held up a hand to stop him. I don't need to see it, she said quietly. I knew. Deep down, I always knew you hadn't just abandoned us. The Daniel I married would never have done that. The Daniel you married died the day they tried to finish you, he said, his voice cracking. When I saw that car wreck, when I thought I'd lost you both. He stopped, swallowing hard. Everything that mattered to me was in that car. My wife. My unborn child. I would have done anything, to keep you safe. Including breaking my heart? Including breaking both our hearts. The silence that followed was heavy with 15 years of unspoken words. Lena watched her parents, these two people who had loved each other enough to let go, and felt tears sliding down her cheeks. I didn't just keep the evidence, Daniel said softly. I kept other things too. He reached into his bag again, pulling out a small, worn envelope. Every school photo. Every newspaper clipping when you made honor roll, Lena. The program from your middle school play. The article about your mother's promotion to head nurse. He laid them on the table, these precious fragments of their lives he'd collected from afar. I know it doesn't make up for not being there. Nothing can. But I want you to know that not a single day went by when I didn't think about you both. When I didn't miss you so much it felt like dying. Sarah picked up one of the photos, Lena at her 8th grade graduation, smiling broadly at the camera. I remember looking for you that day, she said. In the crowd. I always looked for you at these things, even though I told myself I was being foolish. I was there, Daniel said. Back row, baseball cap, pretending to be somebody's uncle. I saw you looking. I wanted so badly to let you see me back. Lena watched as her mother's hand trembled, the photo shaking slightly. Then, slowly, Sarah reached out and took Daniel's hand. "We've lost so much time," she whispered. "I know." Daniel's voice was thick with tears. "I know, and I'm so sorry. But I'm here now. If you'll let me be." Sarah looked at their joined hands, then at Lena, who had never seen her mother look so vulnerable. "What do you think, sweetheart?" she asked. "Should we let him try to explain himself over dinner?" Lena felt a smile break through her tears. "I think," she said carefully, "that we have 15 years of stories to catch up on. And maybe it's time we started telling them together." That first dinner together was like walking on glass. They sat around the kitchen table, the same one where just days ago Lena had learned the truth about her father, picking at Sarah's hastily assembled pasta dish. The silence was broken only by the awkward clink of forks against plates, and the steady ticking of the kitchen clock. "The sauce is good," Daniel said, his voice carrying the weight of 15 years of missed family dinners. Sarah gave a short laugh. "It's from a jar. Still, you always knew how to make even simple things taste better." He paused, then added softly, "You still make the basil plant grow in the kitchen window." Lena watched her mother's hand freeze halfway to her glass. "You noticed that?" "I noticed everything," Daniel said. "The wind chimes you hung last spring. The new paint color on the front door. The bird feeder Lena made in woodshop class. That was 2 years ago," Lena said, surprised. "You saw that?" Daniel's eyes filled with a mixture of pride and pain. "I saw you working on it through the shop window after school. You were so focused, your tongue sticking out just a little bit, just like your mother does when she's concentrating." Sarah put down her fork, her hands trembling slightly. "All this time, you were so close. Watching us live our lives without you." "I know it sounds strange," Daniel admitted. "Maybe even a little creepy. But it was all I had. All I could safely do to stay connected to you both." "Did you?" Lena hesitated, then pressed on. "Did you ever think about just coming back? Before now?" "Every day." Daniel's response was immediate. "There were so many times I almost broke. When you had that bad fall in the school play, Sarah, I was in the audience. I wanted to run down there, help you up. Or when Lena won the science fair in 6th grade, I was so proud I nearly walked right up to congratulate you. Why didn't you?" The question burst from Lena before she could stop it. Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. After a moment of scrolling, he handed it to them. On the screen was a photo of a car parked across from their house, a black sedan with tinted windows. The timestamp showed it was from just 2 years ago. "They were still watching," Sarah whispered, understanding dawning on her face. "Even after all that time. They were patient. Thorough." Daniel's voice hardened. "But they got sloppy eventually. Started taking bigger risks with their money laundering. That's what finally brought them down, not my evidence from 15 years ago, but their own greed." Lena took the phone, zooming in on the car. "So when the newspaper said they were caught, I had to be sure," Daniel said. "Really sure. I spent months verifying every arrest, every conviction. Following the money trails to make sure there weren't others waiting in the shadows. I couldn't risk coming back until I was absolutely certain they were all gone." Sarah reached across the table and took his hand. The gesture was tentative, like she was touching a wild animal that might spook and run. "And now? Are you certain?" "As certain as I can be." He squeezed her hand. "The organization is dismantled. The key players are either finished or in maximum security prisons. The money's been seized. There's nothing left for them to protect, or to come after us for." "So you're really staying?" Lena asked, trying to keep the hope out of her voice but failing. Daniel looked between them, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "If you'll have me. I know I can't just walk back into your lives and expect everything to be okay. I've missed so much. Hurt you both so deeply. But if you're willing to give me a chance." "It won't be easy," Sarah warned. "We're not the same people you left behind. Lena's growing up. I've changed. You've changed. I know. Daniel's voice was soft but determined. But maybe we can get to know each other again. Build something new from the pieces we have left. Lena felt something warm and hopeful unfurling in her chest. We could start small, she suggested. Maybe you could come to my violin recital next week? Both her parents turned to look at her with surprise. You play violin? Daniel asked, his face lighting up. I didn't know that. I just started this year, Lena admitted. I'm not very good yet, but... She's being modest, Sarah interrupted. She practices every day. Her teacher says she has a natural talent. Like your grandmother, Daniel said softly. She played violin too. I never told you about her, did I? Lena shook her head, eager to hear more. She taught music at the local college. Used to say that music was the only language that could speak directly to the soul. He smiled at a distant memory. She would have loved to teach you. Tell me more about her, Lena said, leaning forward. Tell me everything. And so he did. As the evening wore on, the awkward silence gave way to stories. Stories of family members Lena had never known, of her parents' early days together, of the little moments Daniel had witnessed from afar. Sarah began to add her own memories, filling in the gaps, correcting details, sometimes laughing, sometimes wiping away tears. The pasta grew cold on their plates, forgotten as they wove together the threads of their separate lives into something that might, with time and care, become whole again. Later, as they cleared the dishes together, an oddly normal family activity that felt both strange and right, Lena noticed her mother watching Daniel with an expression she'd never seen before. It wasn't quite forgiveness, not yet, but it was something close to understanding. You know, Sarah said, handing Daniel a plate to dry. Lena's recital isn't the only thing happening next week. The hospital is having its annual fundraising dinner on Saturday. I usually go alone, but... Daniel nearly dropped the plate. Are you asking me to come with you? I'm saying it might be a good opportunity. To start being seen together in public. To start explaining to people. She gestured vaguely. All of this. What will you tell them? Lena asked, curious how they would explain his long absence. Sarah and Daniel exchanged a look, years of shared history passing between them in a silent moment of understanding. The truth, Daniel said finally. Or at least enough of it. That I had to go away to protect my family, and now I'm back. The rest is our story to tell, when and how we choose to tell it. Lena watched as her mother nodded, accepting this answer. It wasn't perfect, nothing about their situation was, but it was a start. A foundation they could build on, one careful step at a time. As she went to bed that night, Lena heard their voices drifting up from the kitchen, soft and tentative, but growing stronger. They were talking about ordinary things, bills, house repairs, the weather, but she could hear the extraordinary weight behind each word. The weight of 15 years of silence being slowly, carefully broken. 3 months had passed since the day Lena found a wallet that changed everything. The seasons had shifted, winter's chill giving way to early spring, and with it came other changes too. Daniel had moved from his cramped apartment at Maple Grove into a small house just 10 minutes away, close enough to be present in their lives, but far enough to give everyone the space they needed to adjust. Tonight was different though. Tonight he was back in their kitchen, helping prepare a special dinner. It was Lena's 16th birthday. Are you sure about this? Sarah asked him quietly as they worked side by side, her chopping vegetables while he marinated the chicken according to his mother's old recipe. Having everyone here at once, it's going to raise a lot of questions. Daniel's hands stilled for a moment. They're going to find out eventually. Better to face it head on together. Everyone meant the extended family and close friends who had been part of their lives during Daniel's absence. Sarah's sister Emma and her husband, Lena's best friend Maya and her parents, a few of Sarah's closest colleagues from the hospital. People who had supported them through the hard years, who had their own questions about the mysterious return of a long-lost father. Lena sat at the kitchen counter, supposedly doing homework but actually watching her parents navigate around each other in the kitchen. It was still strange seeing them together, but strange in a way that was slowly becoming familiar. Like a favorite song played in a different key, the melody was the same, but the harmony had changed. "I invited Mr. Peterson," she said suddenly. Both her parents turned to look at her. "My violin teacher. I thought maybe he could meet Grandma's student." Daniel's eyes widened. Last week, they'd discovered that his mother, Lena's grandmother, had taught violin to Lena's current teacher years ago at the college. It was one of those coincidences that made the world feel smaller, more connected. "That would be nice," he said softly, and Lena could see him blinking back tears. These moments still caught him off guard sometimes. The simple joy of being included in family decisions, of having his past woven into their present. The doorbell rang at 6:30. Sarah smoothed her dress, took a deep breath, and went to answer it. The voices that filtered in from the hallway were curious, excited, and just a little uncertain. "Sarah, honey, is it true?" That was Aunt Emma's voice. "Is he really?" And then they were all in the kitchen, and the questions died as they saw Daniel standing there in an apron, looking both out of place and exactly where he belonged. The silence stretched, thick with 15 years of assumptions and judgments about the man who had abandoned his family. It was Maya's mother who broke it. "Well," she said, stepping forward with a warm smile, "it's about time we met you properly, Mr. Carter. Maya tells me you make an excellent marinade chicken." The tension cracked like ice in spring. Soon the kitchen was full of conversation, laughter, and the inevitable questions. Daniel answered them as honestly as he could without revealing the darker details. Yes, he had been away protecting his family. No, he couldn't talk about the specifics. Yes, he regretted every day he missed, but he was here now. Mr. Peterson arrived last, carrying a violin case that made Lena's eyes light up. "I brought you something," he said, opening it to reveal a beautiful vintage instrument. "This belonged to my teacher, your grandmother. She left it to me when she passed, but I think she'd want you to have it." Daniel made a choked sound, and Sarah quietly took his hand. Later, after the chicken had been devoured and the cake cut, after Lena had played a piece on her grandmother's violin that brought tears to more than a few eyes, the party moved to the backyard. String lights twinkled overhead, and the spring air was warm enough to be comfortable. Lena found her father standing slightly apart from the group, watching as Sarah laughed at something Aunt Emma had said. "You okay?" she asked, coming to stand beside him. "Yeah," he said, but his voice was thick with emotion. "Just taking it all in. For so long, I could only watch moments like this from a distance. Being here, being part of it." He shook his head. "Sometimes it feels like a dream. But it's not," Lena said firmly. "You're really here. We're really figuring this out." Daniel turned to look at her, really look at her. In that way he had that made her feel both seen and understood. "You know, when you found my wallet that day, I was terrified. I thought everything I'd sacrificed to keep you safe would fall apart. But maybe..." He smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. "Maybe you were exactly what we all needed. A brave girl who wasn't afraid to ask hard questions and demand honest answers. I get that from both of you," Lena said. "The stubbornness, I mean." He laughed, and Sarah glanced over at the sound, her face softening when she saw them together. "It's not perfect," Daniel admitted quietly. "There are still moments when I feel like an outsider looking in. Days when the weight of everything I miss feels overwhelming. But there are good moments too," Lena reminded him. "Like when you helped me with my calculus homework last week. Or when Mom called you first when her car wouldn't start. Or right now." Daniel wrapped an arm around her shoulders, and Lena leaned into the embrace. It was getting easier, these moments of physical affection. Less awkward, more natural. "Your mother and I are seeing a counselor," he said suddenly. "Together. To help us work through everything. I thought you should know." Lena nodded, understanding what this meant. They were committed to making this work, to healing properly, not just patching over the wounds of the past. Sarah joined them then, drawn perhaps by the sight of them standing together under the string lights. "Maya's parents are leaving," she said. "They invited us all over for dinner next weekend. All of us? Daniel asked, and Lena heard the hope in his voice. All of us, Sarah confirmed, reaching for his free hand. We're a package deal now. It might be complicated, it might be messy, but it's who we are. Standing there in the gentle spring evening, surrounded by the people who had chosen to accept and support their unconventional journey, Lena felt something settle in her heart. The story of how a lost wallet led to a found father wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. There would be more challenges, more awkward moments, more healing to do. But for now, this was enough. The warmth of her father's arm around her shoulders, the sound of her mother's laugh, the weight of her grandmother's violin waiting inside, and the knowledge that sometimes the best endings aren't really endings at all. They're just new chapters, waiting to be written together.